Okay.
What is happening, everybody? And this is an NFL Live Before Lock that I've been waiting for, I don't know, 4 or 5 days. It's been on my mind for a while. It's been a long time looking forward to this because Laufey, he's out today. He's got little kids. They've got Halloween plans. So in his place, who steps in other than Chris Spags, who also had to do the NBA show? We got lots of people out with it being the holiday and whatnot. So Spags pulling double duty. I haven't done a show with him in a minute. We DM on Twitter. No, we catch up like once a month, something like that.
We try.
We try. Not our best, but we give it a decent effort. And I've really been looking forward to doing a show with you because there are not very many people that enjoy making fun of Eric Lindquist as much as myself, and you're one of them. So it's gonna be I figure we might have Puppet Lindquist come out.
He's already got his pants still down a little bit. Yeah.
He's already got his pants down. That's right where we left off the last show that we did together. People assume that's how Eric ended up getting his job here. But yeah, so pants already down on the Puppet. I'm really excited to do a show with Spag. I hope you guys are excited to watch it. And if you are, simply like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel. We've got a football game on tonight. Houston Texans taking on the New York Jets. We're going to be breaking down everything you guys need to know to make some money playing DFS tonight. So without further ado, let's get into the show. If you guys have any questions for us, hit us up, either leave a super chat, or if you're a Stokastic sub, at me in the Discord channel. I'll be on the lookout for that. But Spags, how you doing, man?
I'm good. That was great presenting up top by Greg. The exact opposite of what Eric gave me in the last show, where he was plumbing through. He said stattering at some point. He's trying to say smattering. It was awful. It was just one of the worst. But no, great to be here. Great to be here for NFL. Laufey, I usually watch these shows on Thursdays with Laufey on in the background. When I'm not doing kid duty at this time. So happy to be here. Happy he loves his children more than I love mine. So
in fairness, he has 2 of them and you only have 1. So it's like it has to be like more focused attention. And also, I don't even know how he's getting around because he apparently blew his knee out the other day playing hockey. So,
oh my God, that boy, he's learning. I feel like because Laufey's like mid-30s, he hasn't hit that point yet where you realize, oh boy, I'm gonna go on long walks and stop trying to do things. Otherwise, I'm gonna be in catastrophe. But no, I'm glad to be here. My kid's already going to bed. The wife's doing that part, so there's nothing fun I'm missing out on. I'm just replacing work with different work that actually pays me. So it's a win-win.
Did you go trick-or-treating with Luca earlier?
They went actually while I was doing the NBA show, but they just went around the neighborhood a little bit. Apparently one of the blocks nearby is like going off, like they're having parties outside. They gave my mother-in-law and my wife shots of Jack Daniels, which maybe they're trying to get in both their pants. I don't know, but they didn't give Luke any, so thank God.
I just if you go to somebody's house and their trick or treat giveaways or shots of Jack Daniels, suspicious to me. There's something doesn't quite add up. I think the authorities should be notified.
But you're in the suburbs too. That's suburban living where everybody just gets together. Just a bunch of Philly people who all get out of here.
There was one kid that showed up to my house earlier in a giant inflatable T-Rex costume and could it must have been like 12 feet high. Like he could barely fit on my porch because the head of his costume was like hitting into the top of my porch. So it was an insane costume. I think I remember that exact same kid from last year as well, but whatever. We got an NFL slate to talk about. First thing I want to ask you though, is it surprising to you that the Jets are 2.5-point favorites over the Houston Texans, considering they just lost a few days ago to the New England Patriots?
A little bit, but the Jets are honestly just like one of the most public teams in the world right now between the national TV games they keep getting over and over again, the coverage. I mean, we're getting like Lakers level coverage for Aaron Rodgers so far to start the year. And granted, we have not had the flip side of the drama yet, but they're just like a national soap opera. So I get why they're on TV. I guess relative to the spread, I think that's just how it goes. You get more exposure. People start to go buying in a little bit more. And the Jets, I think, are one of those teams where, remember the Eagles a couple years ago and their dream team run with Vince Young and the gang and Asamoah and those guys. Feels like the Jets are the same thing, where it's like you're pairing all these guys. People are like, wow, Garrett Wilson, he's a young guy on the breakout who's never really broken out. This year he's playing well, but he hasn't broken out. Breece Hall, he broke out. Now he's going the wrong way and losing touches to Braylon Allen. It's just a team that's not what people think it is. And I think maybe that offers some opportunity on this slate, unless you're playing Mike Williams a captain, then it doesn't.
Yeah. We've got a Matt Martin in the Discord channel added us to ask a question. He says, are the Jets due for a big game tonight? Not really. And we'll kind of lead into this being like a general overarching discussion about the slate and how my lineups are looking. But no, because I think they might just be bad. Like are the Patriots due for a big game? I don't think so. Are the Jaguars due for a big game? No, I don't really think so. And the Jets, the reason they're favored is because of how shorthanded the Texans are and how banged up they are, particularly with the pass catchers. Nico Collins, he's been out, hamstring injury, not expected to return until week 10. You've got Stephon Diggs out for the season. So what once looked like a stacked wide receiving core for the Houston Texans, it's Tank Dell, who has not looked the same post broken leg injury. Dalton Schultz, who hasn't been all that involved this year. And then Spags and I are going to have to try to figure out who the third wide receiver is for the team, or the third pass catcher, which would be the second wide receiver for this team that we're going to want to be playing in DFS contests, because it kind of gets really thin after those couple of guys. So for your question is, are the Jets due for a big game? No, not really. I don't think that because they've been bad, they have to be good now all of a sudden. They might just be bad, but this is not a game that's expected to be played at a very high pace. There's a fairly low total. And when I'm looking at my lineup, Spags, tell me if this is the case for you as well. As always on showdowns in our sims, kickers pop up a ton. That's like an inevitability in our data. Defense is also showing up as much as I've seen at any point in time over the course of the season, which also makes sense to me. Really good defensive line for the Houston Texans. Aaron Rodgers has just not looked very good this year. There's opportunities for sacks, opportunities for turnovers. And on the other side with CJ Stroud, like, what is the passing game going to look like for Houston with him now missing his two top pass catchers? So I think this could be a fairly low scoring game. I like the kickers and the defenses as opposed to Matt's question where he said, are the Jets due for a big game? No, I think that like every other showdowns, like kickers and defenses are probably due for a big game.
Yeah, the kickers and defense are coming up a ton. I mean, the Texans seem to be dominating the top ROI lineups with the sim. So, as Greg mentioned, a team that does create good pressure, 12% QB hurry rate on the year. They're pressuring 27% of the time, which is towards the higher end. So, they're getting home. And for Aaron Rodgers, I mean, he's a little more mobile than we probably think. You've seen him flash it a little bit on runs. Like, he can still move around a little bit, but when he gets hit, he's got, I'm sure Greg remembers this, when Tom Brady is last year, when he got hit in a few of those games, it's like you saw him back there and he's just like, I'm too old for this shit kind of face back there. Like, that's Aaron Rodgers right now when he gets pressure. So it could fall apart pretty easily. That said, I do think, as we always talk about for showdowns, and I in particular, I think is one of the things that stands out the most about showdowns. The best plays are one thing, what wins a showdown is a different thing. I do think kickers and defense are so obvious and coming up so often that you'd start to think about playing it like the Jets being due for a good game. But in reality, like, this should be a lower scoring game. It should be a more defensively minded one. But if that fails, then you're hopefully on a unique path.
And now starting with the QBs, for the flex spot, yeah, like I'll get myself some exposure to Rodgers, some exposure to Stroud, but I'm much higher on the running games in this spot, Spags. And it's because of a lot of the reasons that we had just mentioned. Two defense. I know the Jets defense hasn't been good so far this year, but just from a talent perspective, I think they should be better going forward. And then also the Texans offense, them just being banged up, particularly at the wide receiver spot, that I find it really hard to prioritize the quarterbacks, especially in the MVP spot on FanDuel or the captain spot on DraftKings, just because I don't know what the ceiling is for either of these QBs realistically. Like, there's one for CJ Stroud for sure. We've seen it at times with the wide receivers out. I don't think it's all that likely. So I am not going to be getting to the quarterbacks in the multiplier spots. And then as far as flex options go, yeah, I'm willing to get exposure to them, especially across a bunch of lineups, but I'm going to be underweight to the field. And that's what I'm getting in the Sims. So quarterbacks, do you feel differently than me? And do you have a preference between Rodgers and Stroud?
I do like the concept of these guys at captain a little bit just because they will be lower owned. And frankly, for Rodgers, just a little bit too cheap, which has been an issue. I think a lot of people who are really in the showdown weeds have mentioned with showdowns this year is that the QB pricing a little bit soft. And, Stroud, the price is a little bit tougher being 10K flat. But do think for him having the upside still. And at this point, theoretically a more concentrated target share where if he were at captain, it's largely because Tank Dell hit to a certain amount. Dalton Schultz hits to a certain amount. Besides that, as Greg mentioned in the top of the show, like, yeah, you could debate who's wide receiver 3, but those guys, you don't have to put them in a stack with Stroud at captain. I think it could work, but I agree, sim-wise, it doesn't come up very often. Again, it's this low of a total. It's two teams with dominant, running backs as well that also have a pretty good share. Mixon in particular, a really good red zone share. So the most expected outcome, I think, would not be a QB at captain, but for a tournament, I do think they will be underrepresented for, players that are relatively cheap for what QBs have been historically.
By the way, for anybody who's playing the NBA DFS slate, be known that Kyle Filipkowski is going to be starting in place of Lauri Markkanen. That is also partially code me telling that to Spags as we go here. But Filipkowski is going to be starting in place of Markkanen. If you guys
is he better than Laravia? Do we have an answer for that?
Not quite yet.
No. Okay.
Not quite
I'll
yet.
figure. Yeah, no, please go on. I'll figure it out in the next 15 minutes.
We do have some questions that are coming to us both via super chats as well as questions in Discord. But first up, Bin Snappin says, "Ain't no party like a Diddy party." Well, that's certainly true. And then he wants to, yeah, actually, Eric tells me about those parties all the time. Yeah, Eric's probably the only one who volunteered to go. He wanted to be one of those people that was locked up in the rooms with the cameras overhead, but whatever, his personal
The
preference.
more baby oil, the better, is what Eric would say.
Eric was the one who brought it all. They even, Diddy was trying to tell me, he's like, "Can you stop bringing over the baby oil?" And he's like, he's like, it was 10 for 20 at Costco. And he just kept bringing more and more of them. So I've been snapping anyways. This ain't no party like a Diddy party. Then he wants to know, high dollar single entry captain, please and thanks. If you're building one lineup for, say, like $100 single entry or something like that, Spags, who would you go with as your captain in that lineup?
I mean, the most obvious one to me is Joe Mixon. I'm not sure for a single entry I'd want to just die on the hill of the chalkiest of plays, but I do think if, for me and how I would play the high dollar single entry, I'd probably play a little bit safer and go Mixon, whose workload's fairly guaranteed. Hard to imagine him not punching in a touchdown. For the purest upside, I think Garrett Wilson's kind of intriguing for that kind of format, but the binary plays to me would be Mixon or Breece Hall if you want to just, try to make your money and cash and hopefully a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, those are certainly the captains I get the most exposure to. Running everything through the Sims, I was getting to well over 20% of Mixon, well over 20% of Breece Hall. No other players are showing up more than 10% of my lineups in that captain spot. Overall, my two favorite payups, which just makes sense, right? If I don't like the quarterbacks all that much, it stands to reason that I'm going to like the running backs a good amount, because if I don't love the quarterbacks, I'm not going to love the pass catchers as much either. So Devontae Adams, Garrett Wilson, I also kind of have a hard time differentiating between which one's going to be the guy for the Jets moving forward. So I just gravitate towards Mixon and Breece Hall. And of the two of them, I feel better about Joe Mixon, Spags, because at least with him, there's no Braylon Allen lurking. It's something that Gajewski and I talked about on the strategy show this morning, where you don't know when it's going to happen, but you just get these games where all of a sudden it's like, hey, the Jets are on the 5-yard line. Here comes 3 running plays in a row for Braylon Allen, and Breece Hall isn't in the game. You know that Joe Mixon is the guy in the Texans backfield. Anybody else they've tried this year, but Dameon Pierce, constantly hurt. Ogunbowale, dog shit. He's averaging like 1 yard per carry. Cam Akers, they got a couple of starts. It went so bad that they just traded him for a 6th-round draft pick. So you know Joe Mixon is the guy for Houston. With that being said, my two favorite captains, Joe Mixon, Breece Hall. My favorite overall one, and the one that I like the most for single entry, it is Joe Mixon, just because I feel most secure about his role. Do you have a preference between Mixon and Hall?
It's definitely Mixon for me. Breece Hall's been a guy I've been down on. I do best ball content from, basically January on my YouTube channel, Splash Play. And I've been low in the Jets the entire year, so I do come in with some priors kind of against them. But I think with Mixon, like Greg mentioned, the red zone role is just so different, and really is a big, palpable difference between the true bell cow backs out there, your Mixons, your McCaffreys historically, your Kyren Williams is this year, and guys who just get, a couple of red zone looks. Joe Mixon getting 4.8 per game inside the 20-yard line, 2.4 inside the 10-yard line. Breece Hall getting 2.4 inside the 20-yard line, 1 inside the 10-yard line. That's not true bell cow work. And I think with Breece Hall, I get people love him. I get he's had some big plays. He's overcome a lot of adverse situations for the Jets. But the biggest one that he's having a hard time overcoming this year is that he's not as efficient. The volume's not there as much. Braylon Allen, you have a direct pivot there who takes, 10 touches away in most games. So I think for Breece, it's just you have competition. There was Joe Mixon. He's the guy. If he gets hurt, Dameon Pierce will come in, theoretically. But Mixon is just way more of the guy, I think, for his team than Breece Hall is for his team.
And now talking about the other running backs, I can't make a case for anybody in the Texans backfield outside of Joe Mixon, but there is a case to be made for Braylon Allen. But for this particular slate, Spags, where we do have a lot of value as far as cheap pass catchers go from the Texans, because there is no Collins and there is no Stephon Diggs, you get these guys who are cheap that make sense, and we'll talk about which ones we like the most. But do you like getting to Braylon Allen at all in GPPs today, considering that there is an upside there? He clearly has talent. You just don't really know what his workload is going to be like on a week-to-week basis.
Yeah, I was actually just workshopping a lineup before this one that's going to be in the biggest tournament, because I just wanted to make sure it was good before I opt in, because I didn't want to do a ton of entries today with the multiple shows before lock. But I think, to me, the pivot is if you go Braylon Allen, you have to get a touchdown with it. And Braylon Allen is getting decent enough red zone work. I mean, 0.6 red zone touches game. It's a little bit less than I would have thought. 0.3 inside the 10-yard line. He's getting some work there. He could certainly break a big play. And if Breece gets dinged up, Breece gets, tired, whatever the case may be, he can come in. Whereas really isn't that guy for the Texans. For the Texans, I guess the equivalent would be they get a lot of 3rd and longs. You might see Dario Ngubawale out there a little bit more for those plays. He's under 10% owned, so maybe that would make him a play, but probably not over Mixon. Whereas like Braylon Allen, if he takes the touchdowns away, if Brees just kind of is inefficient, I do think that Braylon Allen can actually make a lineup over Brees relative to their salary. So Braylon Allen's a credible play to me. And in fact, he's going to be not crazily owned, I think is a positive.
And just to make sure, just to reiterate here, no interest in anybody in the backfield from the Texans outside of Joe Mixon?
No, I mean, I think if I were playing 150 tonight, I'd probably maybe take a few shots at Ogunbowale with Mixon and without, just in the hopes that you get a game script then where the Jets are getting a lot of sacks. They're in third and longs, they're not creating good plays, and you kind of can then parse out the game script from there. I'd be willing to do that, but if I'm just putting in a handful of entries, I feel like I just wouldn't consider those other guys.
All right. Next question that we have from our Discord, which, by the way, if you are a Stokastic sub, make sure you get in our Discord channel. It comes with all of our memberships. And if you don't have an NFL membership right now, I've got a deal for you. We had somebody, did you see on Sunday, Spags? We had a sub who won $1 million.
I did, and I think you guys have promoted it well because I've seen it in content many times too. But
there we go.
Rick, you guys many numbers. I don't know the numbers yet.
You're about to see it again. We had our friend here, Rick, 1, 2, 3, 2, 4. He watched NFL Live before lock on Sunday. He won $1 million. He's using the Sims tool. He made a little bit of tweaks based on what Ben Raza and Lofty were saying on the deep dive while he was watching. Ends up winning $1 million. And because he won $1 million, we want to celebrate. And if you guys sign up for any of our NFL packages and use the promo code MILL, M-I-L-L, there's a link down below in the YouTube description box. You get 30% off any NFL subscription you guys want to sign up for. Weekly package, monthly package, the core package, the Sims Max package, whichever one it is that you decide is for you, you could sign up using that promo code MILL, get yourself 30% off. So shout out to Rick, who was it? Bunt Cake was his Twitter handle. Won $1 million on Sunday. So shout out to him. And if you guys want to sign up, take advantage. Win $1 million like Bunt Cake did and get access to our Sims tools with that promo code MILL. Let's get back to talking about the slate now. And Zach Attack wants to know, any concerns with a kicker coming off the street like Patterson? So we've actually seen this one other time this year. If you remember, Greg Joseph gets signed by the New York Giants. And what was that? Also right off the couch. I think he got signed like the day before. Comes out, optimal lineup in Showdown. I'm sure there's a little bit of a drop off with a guy coming right off the couch and just walking into an NFL game, Spags. But kickers are such good value options in showdowns and always show up as such in our Sims tools. Like, I don't really know how to quantify it that he was coming off the couch yesterday. He shows up in a bunch of my lineups running everything through the Sims. I think he's a great option. I'm not going to lie to you that it could play an impact. I just don't know how to quantify it. He shows up in lineups. I'm good with him. Is this something you're concerned about?
No, I mean, Riley Patterson comes up a lot in lineups. Again, the tournament part of me thinks then, all right, can we play some Kaimi Fairbairn and try to get that kicker on kicker leverage? Because one kicker in many showdowns is making the lineup very often this year. But Riley Patterson, I think the one thing that makes me not want to make that pivot move would be Riley Patterson is probably not a lot of things casual players know. Like the Monday and Thursday showdowns and Sunday nights to a lesser extent are just like casual fest for the most part. So I think some of them wouldn't shock me if honestly Greg Zuerlein had a little bit of ownership because they're like, oh, hey, like he's still the kicker, right? And might even ignore the fact he's got an IR tag on him or whatever. But I think for Riley Patterson, probably the lack of name brand, lack of box score games keeps him down. And Zuerlein's quietly had good usage. He's had an awful year. He's missed a lot of kicks. It feels like every time they're on one of these island games. So I think Patterson's a good play. I think assuming that, the sharp players, the DFS players jam Patterson a lot because his optimal rate looks good. His sim rate looks good. I think then playing Fairbairn is kind of leverage against that makes sense as well. And you're also theoretically getting some leverage on Mixon touchdowns with that. I think playing either kicker looks good, but Patterson sim-wise looks like one of the most important plays for the top ROI lineups.
Yeah, that's how I see it as well. It's something it's just hard to know. I mean, do we even really know which kickers are the best? Like last year, if I was to ask you to make a list of the best kickers in the league, Justin Tucker would be on it and probably one of the best kickers in NFL history. This year, people are calling for Justin Tucker to be cut and not be the Ravens kicker anymore. Like things change very quickly at the position. So Riley Patterson, yeah, I think he's one of the top overall options on the slate. Going and talking now about the wide receivers, now that we have the Texans being shorthanded, do you have a lean towards who's going to be the number 2 wide receiver? Not number 2 in terms of target share for pass catchers, because I think Dalton Schultz is going to take that mantle with Tank Dell being the number 1 guy. But if we're just talking about wide receivers and some of the cheap value options that are available to us from Houston, do you have a lean of a direction you like to go? Because there's a number of different ways that it could end up going.
So the guys who run the most routes been Xavier Hutchinson. I liked him coming out of college. I kind of thought when Nico Collins went out that he would be the one that takes over that role because in college at Iowa State, which Eric would know, great downfield guy, made some good targets, basically a boundary receiver, one of very few in that class that looked pretty much palatable relative to playing outside and being good at it. That said, Hutchinson's been out there enough. He's not getting targeted well. I think Robert Woods would be the one who had the most routes last week. Mechie wasn't too far off. Those are the ones to look at. Woods, I think, is a more credible play as just a veteran receiver who, against a fairly tough defense, at least historically, even though the Jets defense going the wrong way since they fired Robert Saleh, still a guy that can get open in space against a theoretically tough defense. So I would favor Robert Woods. I know the snaps are there for Hutchinson. Maybe they're there a little bit less this week, more 12 personnel, more Cade Stover. Certainly a possibility, and we saw a little bit of that last week. But I would take the shot on Woods, I think, just because I don't know. I really don't have a strong lean for it. Mechie gets some red zone work. Hutchinson downfield should be there, but it hasn't been there. So I think it's Woods.
Yeah, I'm with you. Robert Woods is the guy for me. He also seemed like the guy who throughout the day is projected for the least amount of own. Not that any of them are crazy popular. It's kind of spread out. But the one I gravitate the most towards it is Robert Woods. We've seen him be an NFL caliber player in the past. I know he's way washed at this point, but at least we've seen something out of him. I don't know what to expect out of Hutchinson or somebody like Mechie, just because we haven't seen them play all that much. And then over on FanDuel, Hutchinson just out of the picture for me, because I don't know if you've seen what his price point is over there, but he's crazy expensive. He's over 10K as far as his salary is concerned. So I don't want to pay up for him over on FanDuel. He would be more DraftKings specific if I got to him.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. So that's a crazy price tag to have even for a short slate.
As far as the other Texans pass catchers go, I really like Dalton Schultz. Tank Dell also makes sense. The field's going to be there. I don't have like a strong take on Tank Dell versus the field. Of every pass catcher in the game, my favorite overall is Tank Dell Spags. And then my second favorite, though, it's Dalton Schultz, because I do think that he's the guy who ultimately is going to benefit the most from a fantasy standpoint, considering the current spot that the team is in being shorthanded. They spent a bunch of money on him in the offseason. Tank Dell, as well as Dalton Schultz, do you have any kind of takes on those two?
So Schultz, I like, Tank Dell, I think people are going to be worried about. I know some people were asking me this morning on the video I did on my Splash Play channel. Like, we're asking about, is Tank Dell going to get shadowed by Sauce Gardner? And number one, shadows don't really matter that much. There's only like a handful of teams that deploy it. Literally, I think this week about 2 teams expected to have a shadow, one of which the shadow corner is not that good in New England. So wouldn't worry about that. He will see some Sauce. I think the biggest gap, though, between how guys have played with Nico Collins on the field, with Stephon Diggs on the field, and not having those guys, and is Dalton Schultz. Dalton Schultz has historically, it's not the biggest sample size, only 2 games compared to like 20 or so overall, but he's had about 30 more receiving yards, similar amounts of targets, not more touchdown equity, but I don't really know the red zone and end zone stuff works in that. But Schultz, I think, gets a pretty big boost here. Probably better routes, certainly more trusted than some of the other receivers coming in for Houston. So Schultz is a guy I considered a captain this morning, ended up going a different direction. But I think for him, I think he's got the upside to get there. And 2 touchdowns for him would probably make a captain if this isn't a high scoring game at all.
Yeah. And I mean, that's one of the other things too. I don't expect a very high scoring game. That's why like the defense is a little bit and the kickers a whole bunch as well. Jets pass catchers now. And clearly the value is going to be on Houston, considering how shorthanded they are and that Stephon Diggs, him being out, isn't really properly priced for. What do you make of the dynamic between Garrett Wilson and Davante Adams? Because I'm really unsure who's going to be the guy that commands more targets moving forward.
So Adams has been really bad against certain defenses the year. What jumped out to me this morning looking through everything was how bad Adams is versus man defense. And he's going to see a decent amount of man defense today in Houston. Houston plays at about 36% of the time, which is towards the higher end, not quite as high as like Detroit, Jacksonville, some of the other outliers, but high enough. Adams can't get open versus man coverage. He's got 0.5 yards per out run despite a 26% target per out run rate. So like getting good work, not being efficient, negative 0.8 EPA per target as well for him against man defense. So Adams, to me, the lack of workload for the Jets, I thought last week was kind of his get right spot. He didn't get right. Instead, Garrett Wilson got it again. On the year, still, Garrett Wilson has better red zone work, 1.9 red zone targets a game. So I'd rather play Wilson. Like, and I'm not the biggest Wilson guy in the world. I think he's kind of underperformed the first 2 years relative to how people perceive him. But now people don't want him quite as much. He'll be owned, comparably to Davante Adams. But I don't know. Even that, I'm not sold on. Because casual people love Davante and think he's due for a big game. Maybe he is, but I just don't think. I think the best days are behind Davante at this point.
Relative to the field, I'm underweight to both of them, but I do agree with you that if somebody was to, for whatever reason, the situation comes across or somebody holds a gun to my head and says, need to play a lineup and it has to have Devontae Adams or Garrett Wilson, I'm going towards Garrett Wilson, but still relative to the field, underweight to both. I just prefer Garrett Wilson as somebody who I'd want to have a little bit more exposure to than Adams. But once again, my priority, it's going to be the running games as opposed to paying up for the top end wide receivers like Adams or like Wilson. I prefer both Breece Hall as well as Joe Mixon. Are there any cheaper pass catchers from the Jets you like? Because I do find it hard to get to these guys when you got the dynamic with Wilson and Adams demanding a bunch of targets, cheap wide receivers that have upside for Houston. Is there anybody you see from the Jets' point of the game or side of the game where you think they could rival the value of the cheap Houston pass catchers?
Jeremy Ruckert, I think, has some potential for touchdown equity. People love Tyler Conklin a little more than they should, given that the workload's been fairly split. And I think Ruckert not coming up a ton in Sims, so I don't think it's a strong play really, but decent projection on him, 1K salary, just one touchdown can make the lineup if the rest of the salary that kind of fills that lineup actually pays off. So I think Ruckert would be it for me. Besides that, I think people want Malachi Corley to be a thing. He's not inactive at sea, or I don't think if he is. I didn't see it before the game, but if he were, it doesn't really matter because he doesn't do anything. He's out of the picture, even with Lazard going on IR. So I think that's it. Would we count Mike Williams as a cheap receiver? Because I guess he's in play, but it feels like he's a little too expensive at 3,600.
Yeah, I mean, like, if I had to roster a cheap pass catcher from the Jets, he would clearly be the guy. He just hasn't looked the same coming back from the torn ACL. And to me, maybe I'm reading into this too much. Aaron Rodgers seems to have a little bit of contempt for him. Like Aaron Rodgers, and he makes either a bad throw to Mike Williams or Mike Williams runs a wrong route. Like, it really seems to upset Aaron Rodgers when incompletions go the way of Mike Williams compared to other pass catchers on the team. And I think that's one of the reasons, too, that there's been all these rumors that the Jets are potentially looking to trade Mike Williams. I don't think Aaron Rodgers is super fond of him. I think that's also one of the reasons that they went out and they got somebody. I mean, obviously, if you have the ability to get Devontae Adams, you'd always want to add him to your wide receiver room. But I also think that Aaron Rodgers just like, hey, Mike Williams is not getting it done for us as the number 2 wide receiver. So I think that Rodgers' preference would be to have Allen Lazard back. He has his wide receiving group of Garrett Wilson, Devontae Adams, Allen Lazard, and then he could banish Mike Williams to the bench where he never has to look at him ever again. But if I did have to roster a cheap pass catcher from the Jets, like kind of by default, it's him because I don't even know who else I would want to go to for cheap from New York. Because I'm with you. I don't want to roster Malachi Corley.
Yeah, I think it would. Yeah, to me, it's like Ruckert a little bit here, but like in terms of real plays, Mike Williams is like a borderline real play. Getting routes, had 30 routes or 30 snaps last week. So like he's out there. For what it's worth, the Texans do give up a pretty high deep ball temp rate, 9.2% deep shot rate, 20 plus air yards. So that's Mike Williams kind of game, maybe, but it's not a play that I went to tonight.
Got some super chats here, so we'll answer these. And I feel like we've got like a pretty good overview of some of the players that we like targeting the most. We haven't talked specifically about kickers and defenses, but I've made it known that I do like those positions. We can talk about them a little bit more in depth in a second. But first, your guys' questions. Shout out to Matt Martin, who not only left us some questions in Discord, but also a super chat here. He says he prefers to bet contrarian. Okay, I'd want a little more information what you mean by betting contrarian, just like anti what the public is betting. But that aside, he wants to know, how do I do so in DFS successfully and tips to do so tonight? Yeah, so the way that you're contrarian in DFS is you could find players who are lower owned that you want to be overweight to. A couple of ways that are most sensible to do it using the tools on our site. One, the Boom Bust tool. Or if you look at for the single game plays tool that we have right here on the site, you'll see that relative to some of our data and projections, which players that we are expecting to be under or over owned relative to what we think their odds of success are. So you could find some guys who are maybe, could you sort, Jordan, by the all the way on the right, there's that leverage column on screen. Yeah. So one thing you do here is you can see the Texans. They're pulling some ownership, but nothing like crazy or anything like that. Our data has them being a really under-owned piece on the slate. So that's a way that I'd look at and be like, hey, Texans defense, way to be contrarian. Riley Patterson, another one who our data says should be higher owned. One thing about Showdown, though, you're rarely going to find guys that you really want to play that are like 1 or 2% owned. So it depends how contrarian you're really talking here, Matt Martin. But using our tools, that's one way I would say it. Another way, too, is you just run the Sims and you could find who are the lowest owned players that are showing up overweight in your lineups by using also the leverage column in the Sims tool and seeing who are some of the low owned guys you get overweight to. You could hand build some lineups using the single lineup Sims. based on the lower owned players that show up more heavily in the Sims tool. But specific to this slate, is there any contrarian option that you are getting to Spags to differentiate lineups?
I mean, I think in general, the way that I would view the contrarian stuff is how do I get leverage against the guys that are chalk? And I think that's actually the video that Laffy did with Rick Many Numbers, who just won the Millie too. Kind of talk about that, how he'll run the sim, then kind of work backwards off of that and see, I'm getting a lot of Brees Hall. Can I pivot to James Cook at the same ownership using the boom bust tool and kind of, balance that out accordingly? I think it's in general how I'd view it. So like, if you think about it, game theory wise, how does Joe Mixon not make a captain winning lineup? Or how does he not make a lineup at all? Pass game going nuts for Houston. Jets offense does so well. Defense shuts down Houston. Those are kind of the main ways. So your way you get leverage against Joe Mixon lineups would be either, play Mixon the flex, which is kind of half measure, fade Mixon and go with a pass game attack, or go with the Jets 5-1 onslaught kind of build, maybe a receiver coming back. So I think on this slate, those kind of builds would be logical. 5-1s did not come up a lot to me with some of the numbers I was running before, especially favoring the Texans. So if the Texans ran away with it, I don't think anybody's going to be on that. But that's the best microcosm of contrarianness I can give, I guess.
Yeah, that's another good point too. It could be lineup construction, making onslaught stacks sometimes. Like there are often times that you'll see on showdown slates where one team will be pulling all the ownership. Like it could have been if the Jets Patriots, for instance, was a showdown game. All of the ownership would have been on the Jets side of the game. So they'd be like, oh, there's no way the Patriots end up winning this game. The Patriots suck. I got to roster all the Jets players. And what ends up happening, Patriots end up winning the game. So if you would have built lineups that were skewed a little bit more towards the Patriots, that would have been contrarian. And yeah, I do agree with you too. I do think we're going to see the field lean a little bit more towards the Jets today. So if you go heavier on the Houston side of the game, maybe make a 4-2 or 5-1 Houston stack. That's something also that would be a little bit different for a lineup construction. But yeah, if I want to be different with my lineups today, Robert Woods is the lowest owned player I get myself overweight to the field to. He's only pulling 11% ownership. I even like him in the captain spot as a really cheap captain that allows me to spend up for a bunch of the studs in the game. Do you have because we talked a little bit about the running backs at the captain spot. Who's your more off the board captain option? For me, it's Robert Woods.
That's a tough one, man. I don't know if I see the ceiling for Robert Woods, but I see the logic. You get everybody in with that price point, so I can get there. Garrett Wilson, I think, would be my off the board one. I don't know. Let me check the ownership to see if that's actually off the board right now. But I think that's the play that spoke the most to me as terms of trying to get leverage against Brees Hall a little bit more.
Garrett Wilson
12% owned. That's not.
Or my audio did, one of the two.
No, that's off the wall, like Michael Jackson's pop record off the wall was, with a little bit less touching. So it's. That was mostly for Greg, guys. But yeah, for Garrett Wilson, not off the wall. Looking at the ownership now, I do think the QB captains would be more off the wall. Again, you're getting leverage against the run game. If you went to Stroud, went to Rodgers, Stroud 5% projected ownership, Rodgers 7%. Besides that, Schultz would be the most off the wall guy, I think 5%. And I'm shocked he's only 31% overall. I think Schultz, good projection on him, makes sense game theory wise, what we talked about before. So Schultz would probably be the one I think has the most utility.
Yeah, Dalton Schultz also somebody to get overweight to in the captain spot. I think he's a sensible option. Yeah, for whatever reason, it seems like it was a me issue because somebody in chat said that the mic was fine. But if my audio, your mic cut out, but whatever, non-issue. Also, if you guys haven't done it yet, like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel. We got a super chat from our friend Chris Williams who said, late to the party, but as usual, you guys know the drill. Hit the like button, folks. Bring yourself some good karma. And he says a Rick type karma, not Cats type karma. Yeah. We don't even, that's Voldemort around here. We don't even want to say his name. And then also Chris gifted us out 10 YouTube memberships. So for all the people who just got gifted a membership, thank Chris because it came from him. And as always, Chris, thank you for supporting our channel here. Defenses, kickers, I want to ask you about these as well, Spags, and then I will get back to any questions you guys have that are lingering as we lead up into lock. Do you have a preferred kicker? Do you prefer Patterson over Fairbairn? Do you like both of them? What's your take on the kickers for tonight?
So this is like maybe too inside how I view things. It might not even be sharp really when I get the steep on it. But I do think if I'm going to play Riley Patterson today, I know I'm going to be with a lot of Stokastic people. The Sims right now pushing Patterson at a good rate. So when I see that, I tend to think, okay, Patterson's going to be in a lot of the sharp Sim lineups that I know share projection sets with Stokastic. Then I would think, okay, maybe I get leverage with Kaimi Fairbairn because one kicker tends to be there. I mean, both kickers can make a lineup. Saw somebody ask that in the YouTube chat. But still, generally, there's a push-pull dynamic with that where you're less likely to have two kickers making a lineup. So putting in Fairbairn and leaving out Patterson, I think is kind of interesting. But I think they're both firmly in play. You see a low total like this, that does sometimes scream 6 field goal day if the team can't get going in the red zone. You have 2 good defenses that certainly can stiffen up in the red zone as well. So I think they're both really in play. I'd favor Patterson based on the Sims, but the tournament game theory against the Sims would be to play Fairbairn, I believe.
I'm overweight to both. I like both of them a whole bunch. I do get to more of Patterson, but it's really both kickers for me. And the defense is showing up a ton as well. This is the most defense exposure that I've had on any slate this year. I'm overweight to both kickers. I'm overweight to both defenses. I am going to be watching this game with stupid rooting interest. I'm going to be like, let's get some stops and let's get some long field goals. That's what I'm going to be rooting for tonight. But that's what's showing up in the Sims for me. Jets defense, Texans defense. You've got both teams on the Texans side. You've got shorthanded wide receiving core. I think that's going to present opportunities for the Jets, especially if none of the wide receivers are able to get open. Tank Dell, talk about at the top, hasn't looked all that great this year. And then also on the Jets side of the game, Aaron Rodgers is kind of banged up at this point in the season. I think a big part of some of his struggles, it's just kind of been health. He's in his 40s now. He's coming off the torn Achilles. Remember we had the game, I think it was the one against the Vikings, where it looked like he may have suffered what appeared to be like a serious knee injury. He kind of shook it. He went into the tent for like a half second, and there was a turnover, and he came back out and went on the game, went back into the game. And then Aaron Rodgers said like, hey, yeah, I'm dealing with some swelling and bruising, but nothing really uncommon for him at this point in the season. And it's like, yeah, maybe it's not uncommon, but it's just so much harder to deal with that in your 40s than it is when you were 28 or 29 years old. I mean, just a personal experience for stuff like this. Have you noticed, Spags, you go outside, maybe you're playing sports or something. Do you remember you used to play like tackle football in the backyard? Somebody would tackle you. You just get right back up. You'd be the next play. I don't know if you've fallen and hit the ground recently. It's like it takes weeks to recover from something like that. And obviously, neither you or I are professional athletes. We're sitting here on the internet just talking about football. But I do think there's certainly something too that once you're in your 40s and it gets later on in the season, just these little nagging injuries build up. You don't have the time to recover from them. So anyway, I think it's a really good opportunity for both defenses today. I like being overweight to them.
Yeah, no, I'm fully agreed with that. And I think too, I saw a chat from Dan, it's actually still on the screen, saying, I hate going with the defenses, hate it. But like, that's the thing is like people hate going with the defense. People also hate betting unders. That's why you bet unders, and there's usually a little value on them. So fully with you on that, fully with you too on the being older. Like I mentioned before, the Tom Brady thing, like legit watch these guys during the game, watch the facial reactions when a sack is given up. Even if it's one where like the QB's to blame, you'll see Aaron Rodgers just like, he is just not there for it and he doesn't want to be there for it. So if it starts to get bad, I think that's where you could see things really pile up for the defenses, but both are in play. And again, I can't say it enough. The Texans D, like the ROI on them with everything, they're popping up everywhere for the top ROI lineup. So please don't just fade them outright, unless you're doing that for a reason.
Are you willing to play either the kickers or the defenses in the captain spot?
I would be. I didn't personally today, but I think it would be a perfectly fair thing to do to decrease the ownership a little bit. The tough part of that is you're really then fading the game entirely at that point, and I'm not sure I want to fade the game entirely. But if you don't see rushing touchdowns, the pass games could both not get there and score a touchdown either. So at that point, it becomes a game of who gets the most PPR points, and I think that could work. The build would work. I didn't play it, but I never want to go that far with defense because I know, but I'll put it in 150. Like I don't want to waste it on the least fun outcome. That's also going to get duped more than it probably should.
Yeah, and I do think there's a lot that applies to both sites similarly for today. I'm seeing some people asking about FanDuel and the MVP spot over on FanDuel. So, I mean, the one difference is like there's no reason to take a shot on a cheap MVP over on FanDuel. Like Robert Woods, I think he's an interesting salary saving, differentiating captain over on DraftKings. Never in a million years would you have to roster him on FanDuel, though. So the way I want to gravitate my lineups towards on FanDuel, it's still my favorite overall captains on DraftKings, Breece Hall, Joe Mixon, with Mixon being my favorite choice there. How do you see the FanDuel side of things as potentially being different from DraftKings? Is there an MVP you like on FanDuel maybe you didn't like as a captain on DK?
I mean, I would think with the FanDuel part of it, I didn't like, I could look at the ownership real fast. I don't think the RBs are going to be too less owned here. So I would say that there's maybe a little more value. Garrett Wilson, a little bit less owned. So I do like Garrett Wilson as my contrarian captain today. It's not clear yet. But I think going receiver there forward would be a little more appealing overall than it is on DraftKings, where there's still good ownership going to pretty much every receiver besides Dalton Schultz. But overall here, Tank Dell, 6% at MVP, Devontae Adams, 7.6% at MVP, Garrett Wilson, 8% at MVP. Like, I think these guys a little more appealing, even though, as we've said more than enough times here, hopefully, the RBs are the binary outcome where you're playing micro outcomes, and I think that's a receiver for pretty much every slate.
Yeah, the way that the MVP ownership is breaking down on FanDuel, you got ownership in the 20% range for both Joe Mixon as well as Breece Hall. Then you got CJ Stroud and Aaron Rodgers, both over 10% owned at quarterback. I didn't like them on DraftKings. I don't really like them on FanDuel either when they've got a little bit more ownership going to them. And then nobody else really all that popular. 6% ownership to Garrett Wilson, 5% to Dank Dell, 5% to Devontae Adams. Believe it or not, actually 3% MVP ownership going to the Texans defense. I wouldn't want that over on FanDuel. I'm late on the idea that there's a 3% chance that the Texans are going to be the highest scoring team, or I should say the highest scoring player in the entire game. I never really know when I'm talking about the defenses. Do I refer to them as a player, a roster spot? Like I never really know what the right terminology is supposed to be. But yeah, I wouldn't want to go to the
technical term. Yeah,
yeah, I'll figure it out one day. But Texans defense wouldn't want to play him in the MVP spot over on FanDuel. Every once in a while, it ends up working out where a defense puts up, like 2 touchdowns and pitches a shutout or something like that. But it's once every couple of seasons where you see an optimal MVP captain that's a defense over on FanDuel. Just about 90 seconds left to go here until we get to locks bags. Any final thoughts before we get to the start of the game?
No, I mean, look, I think there's a very obvious outcome based on the data so far, a kicker forward, defense forward outcome. I think trying to play a little bit unique on that is fun, but I think this was a good show for the first show I've done with Greg for a while. I think this is one of the better like game theory. We got the sim plays out. We got the ownership out. I think we covered this about as well as we could, Greg. So thank you for leading me on this journey.
And don't forget, guys, if you want to sign up for the tools on the site, promo code MIL, 30% off any of our NFL packages that you choose to sign up for. Before we close out the show, who wins tonight?
I think I know who's going to win. It's this guy right here. It's Puppet
Oh,
Link.
my God. Look at that.
Hey, everybody. Hey, I'm back. Oh, I'm a little loose. It's Halloween. Went out, did some trick-or-treating, left some razor blades and kids' candy. Now I'm back here ready to talk some shop. And the stream's just starting now, right?
The absolute favorite part of Puppet Lindquist is that he constantly has Spag's hand up his ass. That's his favorite. That's his favorite part of being operated. Look at that. Look at that.
He's got a lot of forearm these days. This guy's been doing curls lately. He's just too much, not enough room in here.
When Eric inevitably goes to prison for mishaps regarding the Diddy parties, he's going to be the first person in prison who brings it to everybody's attention. Like, hey, oh my guys, I dropped the soap. Look over. He's just like calling out to everybody. Look at what's happened over here. The soap's on the ground. I'm going to pick it up.
But he's doing this face a lot too. Like, oopsie.
Oopsie. Guys, thank you very much for watching. If you're not done yet, like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel. Jets, Texans, it's about to start. We also got NBA DFS going on. So, Puppet Lindquist, you can close it out here because you're waving.
Oh, make sure to take that promo code MIL. That guy won $1 million. What I do with him, I'd buy so many humans. Anyway, good seeing you guys. Happy Halloween. Goodbye.
Later, guys.